Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the American Journal of International Law on International Economic Law for a Multipolar World. My name is Jen Malott from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You have all joined in listen-only mode. However, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them into the Q&A box. If the panelists have time, we will address questions during the session, and if not, the conversation can be continued on social media. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please add this to the Q&A box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. To get everything started, I'm delighted to turn things over to Ingrid Brunk, one of the editors-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, who will introduce the panelists.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jen, and Cambridge University Press. So as Jen said, along with Monica Hakimi, I serve as a co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law. This serves as one of a series of webinars that we have up on our website on current topics in international law. So today, our discussion focuses on international economic law in a time of shifting global power dynamics. The world may or may not be entering a period of multipolarity in which other countries begin to rival China and the US in terms of economic, military, and political power. But we are certainly in a time of growing fragmentation in and dissatisfaction with international economic relations and the international legal systems that structure them. Perhaps the most prominent example is the WTO and the collapse of the neoliberal consensus that motivated and undergirded that project, with a growth in industrial policy measures that run counter to many of the premises of free trade. But there are lots of other examples, pretty much wherever you look. Foreign direct investment is fragmenting as policymakers move production to supply chains at home or with trusted allies. There's the growth in sanctions, but an increasing fragmentation, illustrated perhaps best by the G7's inability to get a global consensus in sanctions against Russia. There's dissatisfaction with global financial systems, efforts by BRIC countries to make the dollar less powerful, high levels of debt by many developing countries related to high interest rates and costs of climate change. So those are just a few among many examples. So to discuss these topics, we have a stellar panel today. I will keep introductions very short, which means I'm substantially underselling our panelists, but I know they will be known to many of you, and you can learn a lot more about them at their websites or on social media. So in alphabetical order, I'll introduce first Harlan Grant Cohen, professor at Fordham Law School and an expert in many foundational areas of public international law and many areas of international economic law. We have Sarah Bowerly-Donsman, a political scientist and a professor at Indiana University. Her government and academic expertise includes foreign direct investment, export controls, and economic statecraft. We have Henry Gao, who's joining us at a very late hour, his time. Thank you, double thank you to you. He's a professor of law at Singapore Management University, an expert in the WTO, as well as China and international economic policy. Finally, we have Nick Mulder, a professor of history at Cornell University, who focuses on international and European history. He recently published an extremely well-received and important book entitled The Economic Weapon: The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. So many heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here. And let's just kick it off with the general questions first, and maybe drill down to some more specifics as we move on. Are we in a period of fragmentation or multipolarity, and why does that matter for international economic law? Harlan, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. So first, just thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to AJIL and to Cambridge University Press for hosting this. There is a lot of debate, as you mentioned, as to whether or not we are actually in a period of multipolarity or still in a period of bipolarity or still in a period of unipolarity. I think it probably depends on the context, but I also think the debate is a little bit besides the point. I think the question we should be asking is a relative one, right? Is power and wealth dispersed now in a way that changes existing negotiating dynamics in a fundamental way and changes both what states expect from or want from the international economic law system? And I think if that's the question, the answer is clearly yes, right? We do see a wider dispersion of wealth. And what we're seeing as a result of that is that states don't need to negotiate with the great powers or just the US in the same way that they used to, as you were mentioning, right? States can hold out for more, they can make valuable deals with each other, right? They can ask for more from countries like the United States. And on the flip side of this, right, the United States has to work much harder to get what it wants. It costs more to get what it wants. But I would say the shift is more fundamental, right? With this wider distribution of power and wealth, it's become much harder for states to predict where they're going to end up under the current rules, right? It's harder for them to know whether they'll be on top, in the middle, or on the bottom. There's a sense of insecurity in the rules. And when you combine that with the insecurity and uncertainty presented by new technologies and new challenges like AI and climate change, what you have is you have kind of a general sense that states are now competing for their place within the system, right? We're moving from a system that was built around cooperation to one built on competition. And that then highlights kind of the key kind of thing I think that we need to be talking about, which is that once you move from a system where kind of economic law is an area of cooperation to one where economic law is an area of competition, once you move to an area where economic law is a source of security to one where it's providing some sense of insecurity, right? Then the silos, the walls between international economic law and other fields start to come down, right? They start to be revealed as mirages, right? It becomes harder to distinguish between sort of military security and economic security, right? It's all pandemics, AI, climate change, a matter of national security, right? And that means that you're now going to have portfolios kind of being shifted around, right? Officials who once talked about security are now meeting together to talk about supply chains and trade. Discussions within areas of trade that with the WTO are now going to be talking about security. Going back to your question about fragmentation, right? If at one point, right, fragmentation in international economic law was being driven by disagreements as to what international economic law should do, now at least some of that fragmentation is being driven by disagreements as to whether international economic law should be a separate area of law altogether, whether or not these kinds of conversations should be left to a special place like the WTO or really need to be part of broader conversations.
Thank you. One of the things that really interests me about these developments is whether they are a problem that needs to be solved. And I know the end of the webinar, we're going to come back around to that a little bit, but we see all these changes and to some extent, do they present progress and opportunity in a world in which the prior order was deeply unjust. So I'll put that to one side and come back to that. But Harlan, your comments spurred that in my mind. So Sarah, I'll throw this opening question out to you about the moment we're in and what it means for international economic law.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. And I'd like to also echo Harlan's thanks for organizing this wonderful panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. Oftentimes panels are more interesting and fun when there's a lot of disagreement, but unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news that I'm largely in agreement with Harlan on these points. I will say that, you know, at the top, you talked about, you know, is it the case that, you know, we're moving to a system of multipolarity such that other countries can rival the US and China? And I'm not sure if that's precisely the world in which we are moving towards, but I do think that it's quite clear that we're moving towards a world that's at least fragmenting more in the direction of kind of a US kind of centered way of managing economic activity, and a kind of and China being on the other side of that. There's a lot of variation or nuance that we can pull apart within that. But I think that's the kind of general issue that we're seeing that is amplified by the way that the US has engaged in proliferating a suite of tools of economic statecraft, as well as the types of tools that the Chinese government has been using as well. And so we see that we are seeing changes to large patterns in economic activity, such as trade. Recently, the Wall Street Journal reported that for the first time in 20 years, the US is importing more from Mexico than from China. But then it's also important to note that we live in a complex network of economic activity rather than one that's just a more simple dyadic trade relationship. And so the other thing that we're seeing, and this is also reflected more broadly in changes to supply chains, is that as companies have tried to diversify their supply chains, either because they see that they're getting directives from governments to do so, or incentives to do so, or because they're concerned about different potential ways in which their supply chains could be disrupted in the future, that we're seeing that there's definitely this sort of severance of a direct tie between trade in certain areas between the US and China. But when you kind of peel back beneath the surface, you see that actually there's not a lot of kind of extensive or fundamental decoupling, in that China plus one strategies tend to just be companies moving, like placing another country in between the China and US relationship. And that matters for how we think about international economic law, in terms of how we think about what the effects of different tools will end up having on the global economy. So yes, we see this fragmentation. We definitely see that governments are interested in pursuing strategies of fragmentation, largely in order to try to insulate themselves from their concern that other countries will use tools of economic coercion against them. But at the same time, we also see that there are important limits to the ability of governments to actually get firms to fundamentally fracture the international economic system.
Thanks. That's super helpful, Sarah. I know you're a political scientist, but you've adopted the lawyer's approach. It's always complicated, right? That's a fascinating insight. So, Henry, your expertise is on China, but let me open this question up to you, however you want to answer it, about changing power dynamics and the impact on international economic law.
Thank you, Ingrid. I couldn't agree more with what Hala and Sarah has just said. I would only add that actually we see that this new phase of multipolarization and fragmentation that started about 7 years ago is a bit different from the decades before it. In that, in the current phase, the US, which was previously the status quo power, has now turned into a kind of a revisionist power by trying to shake things up at the international level. So in the field of international economic law, you can see that the US was trying to sabotage the appellate body, and actually succeeded in doing that by destroying basically the dispute settlement system of the WTO. And more broadly, at the international, at the level of general international law, you see that the US started to emphasize on the so-called rule-based international order. On the other hand, you see China, which have long been regarded as the revisionist power, in recent years has completed its assimilation into the world trading system 15 years after its accession to the WTO, and has since then emerged as more of a status quo power, by trying to defend the WTO system, including the dispute settlement system, from the attacks by the US. And at the level of general international law, you see China has been using phrases such as the international system with the United Nations at its core, and the international order based on international law, basically expressing its disagreement with the US by saying that, even though you are the biggest superpower in the world, but you cannot just change international law as you want. You must base whatever we have already with the United Nations and with the international law principles as the basis. So actually, this I think raised some more fundamental questions. First of all, do we need new rules, or shall we try to adapt the existing rules that we have in order to deal with disruptive new powers like China? And second, who should be involved in making these rules? Should we co-opt countries like China, or should we work without them? I would only conclude my remarks with a story that was told by the current Deputy Director General of the WTO, Dr. Zhang Xiangchen, who, before he assumed this position, was China's ambassador to the WTO. Actually, on one occasion, he brought up this example of the International Table Tennis Federation kept changing rules just because China did so well in table tennis. So he was saying that, you cannot keep changing the rules just because we Chinese are so good at playing table tennis. And I think that is something maybe we international lawyers need to consider as well.
Thank you. One really quick follow-up. I think one of the things that's really interesting about your observation about the U.S. Acting as a revisionist power, my sense, and I'd be curious if you share it, is most of the indicia of that change were relatively consistent as we moved from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. So one way to think about the U.S. as a revisionist power would be to sort of date it back to the beginning of the Trump presidency. But do you see that having changed much since Biden became president?
No, not really. I would call Biden's international trade and international law policy in general is something like Trump with manners, So he has better manners for sure, but in terms of the substance, it largely remains the same. You see that, for example, in the WTO, where even though the sabotaging of the appellate body was completed by Trump, but the Biden administration actually had no interest in bringing back the appellate body. And actually, the WTO is going to hold its next ministerial conference a week from now. But as far as I understand from the US administration, they have not really included the restoration of the appellate body on the agenda of the dispute settlement reform. So I would say no matter who's in the White House, Democratic or Republican, things would remain as the same.
Terrific. Let's then move to a specific example or issue area in which we can see how these themes play out. And let's start with sanctions. How do sanctions over time reflect these changes in international economic relationships? And Nick, I'm going to turn to you as the man with a really big book on sanctions to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ingrid, for hosting and for the invitation. It's a great panel to be on. I think with regard to sanctions, it's helpful to keep in mind that when these measures began to be tied to the enforcement of international law about 100 years or so ago, this was a world economy that was extremely Western and particularly European dominated. The US was a big power in GDP terms, but it was really a European dominated world order until the 1940s, after which, of course, the US played a major role in the international order that we still have to some degree, although it's now changing. But since then, of course, the underlying power balance has shifted. So part of the premise of the question, do sanctions reflect something about underlying power structures is correct. I would, however, say that with regard to sanctions, this is not true in other areas, but with regard to sanctions, sanctions are now also shaping the international economic order to a degree that they really were not even 10 or 20 years ago. Part of that has to do with the size of the countries being targeted. Once now Russia is being targeted with sanctions, China is coming under a slow but increasing number of export controls and other forms of economic statecraft. You do start to see that this is having a material effect. And I would just point to the huge and really unexpectedly successful trade rerouting that Russia has managed to pull off in the last 2 years, which is something that no one in the West really took seriously as a possibility. But now we see that that has actually really exposed some of the limits of what the West can do, even when the entire West, we have 30 plus countries, the entire EU, the US, Canada, all the other G7 partners. And as long as India and China and a number of other Asian states are not on board, this will not have a decisive impact on Russia. So that, I think, really shows that underlying power differentials do matter, but it also shows that the use of sanctions is one, not the main or determining, but it is a formative influence now on where we're going in the future. I do think, however, that for international lawyers and for us as kind of system builders, that also holds some promise, though, because it does show that politics and policy has perhaps more of a role and an effect on this order than we might think. I totally agree with what Harlan and Sarah said earlier on this kind of growing fragmentation. But it just seems to me we're entering a kind of not an era of deglobalization, but an era of politics first globalization, where politics is now a first order influence. But that also means that states probably have more control over this landscape than we think. So far, however, in the US and the EU, I see a lot of tinkering and experimentation with new tools. But I think the next step will be what kind of universalizable rules or principles can we discern? Is it still too early for that? Or can we also actually think about some guardrails that can be put in place? So, yeah.
Terrific. That hits home a point that I think Harlan and Sarah made about disciplinary boundaries breaking down. And I mean, I think that means we could think about sanctions in conjunction with other forms of international economic pressure, like export controls and trade, in terms of thinking of who's benefiting and so on. So Sarah, I'll let you pick it up from there on sanctions.
Yeah, in terms of the different tools. Sorry.
However you want to, I know you've done some work on export controls and sanctions, but however you want to take the question or the topic of sanctions.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's a very expansive question, so I want to think about how to kind of narrow my focus a little bit. I agree that we're at a point where sanctions are really shaping the international economic order in important ways, and in ways in which the more that there's a coalition that is sanctioning large countries, that you see adaptation and adjustment that also create challenges for the use of other forms of more negative components of economic statecraft. So when we see that the US-led coalition with the US and the EU is really central to that with respect to the sanctions packages against Russia, that's an example of a sanctions package in the context of a live war, right? Which is very different from what the US and a kind of hobbled together and not always coherent group of allies are doing with respect to China. And I think that that's really important, because we oftentimes think about sanctions as being in the context of along the escalation ladder to specifically war, whereas a lot of what a lot of the export controls on high technology against China are really more about a strategic embargo. And that is a very long-term commitment. Kind of the way that you analyze the effectiveness of those tools is quite different than how you think about the effectiveness of kind of sanctions tools in the context of trying to prevent and then degrade a kind of war economy. And then also, the more that we have kind of this very maximalist kind of sanctioning pressure on Russia, the more that creates this kind of circumvention networks that also allow other countries to find ways to get around the kind of technology export controls as well. And so that's part of why we see this increased fragmentation, is that that in the past, there has normally been an interest in ensuring that if you're going to, put in place sanctions on an economy, that the economy is kind of small enough, and that the sanctioning coalition is big enough that you're kind of isolating that economy from the global economy. But when you attempt to do this with a large economy that has other allies that they can turn to, what ends up happening is you're not isolating that one country from the global economy. You're actually encouraging the creation of kind of parallel economies to flourish. And that's some of what we're seeing right now.
That's fascinating. So it's to take this much more concretely. It's not just that India is buying cheap Russian oil, and in exchange, hard currency is going back to Russia, allowing Russia to effectively evade the G7 sanctions. Sarah, your point is that then that just increases the general trade networks and allows a different network to get around export controls and so on. So the effect is even bigger than we might have thought. Is that a good example?
Yeah, I mean, in a smaller example around kind of the more traditional kind of sanctions on kind of smaller states, one thing that we know from that literature is that as soon as you put in place those kinds of sanctions, you're actually encouraging the flourishing of criminal networks, because the criminal networks are the ones that allow them to try to find ways to evade those sanctions and adapt to them. And this is just at a different scale, which instead of thinking about this in terms of criminal networks, you're instead looking at the ways in which other countries who don't necessarily agree with the purpose or the appropriateness of the imposition of these particular sanctions, will assist in finding workaround solutions. And that is not, I don't want my comments to be taken to suggest that I think that there is no value to sanctioning Russia. It's also important to think about what the alternatives are. And it is certainly the case that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is in violation of international law and very concerning, and that there aren't a lot of other options on the table for allies of Ukraine. And additionally, in addition to those economic sanctions, there's also a lot of military aid that is being brought into Ukraine. But what I am saying is that these things don't always work the way that we might expect them to at the onset, and they can actually kind of create compounding and cascading concerns.
Yeah, not even to mention the push to de-dollarization as well. Speaking of countries that are critical of U.S. sanctions, China has long been very critical of the United States' imposition of unilateral sanctions. Henry, I'd like to turn it over to you. I think this is a really interesting space in which to illustrate your broader comments at the beginning.
Thank you, Ingrid. I like to echo what Nick and Sarah has just said. I agree that sanctions are as effective as trying to catch water with a colander, So this is something that we trade lawyers are very familiar with. For example, if you look at the US-China trade war last year, you saw that China's exports to the US indeed dropped, but you also see a corresponding increase in exports from countries like Mexico and Southeast Asia. So you kind of understand that, where the dropped imports from China came from. So I think we really need to further refine the rules on sanctions evasion. And here I would agree with Nick and Sarah that rather than working alone, the US really need to rely on its allies to make sure that sanctions really work. Second point I would like to raise is the contagious effect of sanctions, with China trying to mirror the US sanctions through the introduction of a well of new laws such as the anti-foreign sanctions law, export control law, blocking statute, unreliable entity list, and so on. The spillover effects of these laws when China tried to start to use trade and economic sanctions against the other countries such as Australia, Canada, and Japan is also something that is worth considering, because if you have two of the largest traders in the world stop playing by the rules, this would have major implications on the viability of the multilateral trading system. Last point I wish to make is actually sparked by a recent comment by former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger, who admitted in an interview earlier this week that the Trump administration actually miscalculated when they launched the first trade war tariffs against China, because they thought that China would easily capitulate without retaliation, and therefore the trade war would stop at with only about $35 to $50 billion worth of exports from China getting tariffs, rather than eventually the more than $330 billion worth of tariffs, worth of exports from China eventually got tariffs. So this kind of told us of the new reality that we have to live with. That is, the US sanctions regime was originally built, as Nick referred to earlier, in an age when the US was effectively the only superpower and could do whatever it wanted to do without worrying about the consequences. But now the US has to contend with the fact that there is another superpower that not only has the power to retaliate, but will retaliate if needed. Therefore, the new sanctions regime will need to be built on the assumption that is how to prevent retaliation and also to minimize the harm of such retaliations to the US itself in order to be effective. And that is something that maybe we international lawyers need to ponder. Thanks.
I also want to highlight the different relationships that sanctions have to international law itself. So there's the period that Nick talked about and that we're all familiar with, and with Russia as well, ways in which sanctions are used often collectively to enforce international law, to bring states into compliance, to discipline them, and hopefully in ways that prevent war, although that's not always the case. So we see sanctions as kind of this disciplining or enforcement effect that promotes international law. But when China announced its new wave of sanctions, it referred to them as countermeasures, suggesting two things about international law, both that those sanctions are in response to violations of international law by another country, meaning the sanctions that other countries have imposed violate international law, and the use of countermeasures, the term countermeasures, also suggested that those sanctions would themselves violate international law if they were not a response to some violation. So there's a sense in which we see, I think, sanctions, sort of instead of enforcing an international legal order, beginning to really detract from it or pull it apart with the accusation that almost all of them violate international law. Is that consistent with how you see the legal issue here, Henry?
Yeah, actually, I guess this is the kind of question that you would get different answers depending on whether you ask public international lawyers or WTO or trade lawyers. Because actually, when China started to retaliate against the US trade war tariff, the MOFCOM actually came up with some statement in which they basically cited to various international law principles, including, for example, Article 51 of the UN Charter, Article 60 of the VCLT, Article 25 of the draft articles on state responsibility, as the basis for saying that China is doing this basically as a response to the US illegal acts. But if you were to ask a WTO lawyer, I think any competent WTO lawyer would easily point you to Article 23 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding of the WTO, which basically states that when even if another WTO member has committed some wrongful or illegal act under WTO law, a member shall not make a determination to the effect that a violation has occurred, unless and until when you seek recourse from the dispute settlement system of the WTO and obtain a positive finding that a violation has occurred, then you can retaliate. So I think from this perspective, I would say that the Chinese retaliations are as illegal under WTO law as the original trade war tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. But I guess, again, as I said earlier, if you were to ask our colleagues who specialize in public international law, maybe we would get different answers.
Harlan?
Just a quick point here. So one thing that kind of builds on what everyone is saying here, I think what you're seeing here is that as sanctions move from the periphery to the center of international relations, right, it becomes harder to figure out both sort of what category of international law they're in and why they're different from all these other forms of economic statecraft, right? There's a typical assumption that, right, sanctions is one topic and these other things like export controls or investment screening or something else. But I think what we're seeing is that all of these are really part of the same phenomenon, that really what this is about states' willingness to use their economic power to try to reshape the world in which they live. And right, and the question is, to what extent are they willing to do that, right? And then the question becomes sort of what rules might apply to that. I do also want to come back to, I think you're going to get there eventually, to this, to Henry's good point about wanting to avoid miscommunication and unwanted escalation. But I think it is valuable to think about whether or not sanctions are a different category or not.
Can I just also interject here to just say one thing that I do want to kind of put a little bit of my own spin on this that might be a little bit different than some of the other panelists, is that I think that I think that the US had real concerns around the way that the WTO was dealing with or whether it was able to effectively deal with concerns around state subsidies and the way in particular that they're used in China. And so I just want to point out that, we oftentimes think of the Trump administration coming in and destroying the appellate body and imposing the Trump tariffs as sort of the opening gambit of this new world that we're in. And that was certainly, to kind of take Henry's point of that, Biden might be more polite, and that the concern around the Trump administration was also kind of how brazen its use of these tools was. But the Obama administration also had a lot of concerns with the WTO prior to the Trump administration. And while the Trump tariffs, kind of continued and are sort of, on the edges moving away, or being resolved, but Biden didn't come in and just kind of cancel them the way that I think a lot of people had hoped. Where we see more movement outside of U.S. China to other countries around issues like sanctioning in the case of Russia, around export controls, around the proliferation of investment screening mechanisms, both inbound and now possibly also outbound. And so I just want to, kind of remind everyone that more is happening in this space than just sort of thinking about this as this began with the Trump tariffs. And I think that Trump tariffs in some ways are kind of outside. They're very important, but when we focus on them in particular, we end up kind of not seeing some of the ways in which these concerns are proliferating in other parts of the world as well, which may also be a reflection of just how there was a lot of agency involved in the imposition of these particular tariffs in ways that pose some real challenges and questions for the international system if one person can come in and really kind of change the game so quickly.
Terrific. That's helpful, and it provides a nice segue to a question we have in the Q&A that's directed to Nick. And the question is, maybe once at one time we primarily thought of sanctions as being imposed by, say, the League of Nations or by the UN Security Council. What we see now is this rise in unilateral sanctions, which is a term that generally refers to sanctions imposed outside of a collective security system. And the question asks what you think of or how you perceive about this blending of sanctions and now it becoming intertwined with other trade remedies and intertwined with the multilateral trade system like the WTO.
Yeah, a great question. So my way of thinking about it has been to still try and keep it's not a hard distinction, but a slightly fuzzy one, but nonetheless helpful, between offensive and defensive forms of economic statecraft. And how to define that is something we can debate. But my first question to ask is, are we trying to change something about our own economy, or intervene in a way that, for example, promotes industry or certain sectors, industrial policy, right? Tariffs fundamentally are in some sense usually about protection of one's own economy, or are we really trying to change the behavior, the performance, even the growth, et cetera, of another economy? Now that obviously, right, there are many boundary cases, so that's not by no means a perfect question, but at least some measures fall much more on one side of that spectrum than the other. And I think we can then help proceed to kind of parse the boundary cases. So for me, sanctions and export controls fall more on the offensive side of the spectrum. Tariffs, industrial policy, stockpiling, all sorts of other things on the defensive side. The difficulty, however, right, is that the US has been using sanctions in ways that technically only work through its domestic legislation, because so much of it is about dollar jurisdictions, right, about control over the US financial system that clearly does have a coercive effect on countries outside of the US. So the boundary between internal and external for a country like the US that has managed to extraterritorially build up so much economic power through private institutions is fuzzier than for most. But for most of the other countries, I think the boundary between internal and external is somewhat clear-cut, particularly in the case of China, right, where the onshore-offshore distinction does really matter. I totally agree with Henry's points about China also now being very active in experimenting in this space. But one sense that I do have is that they are not as likely to go as far in offensive economic statecraft in the future, simply because their experiments with it so far have really not been very successful at all. If you look at the forms of economic coercion that they've used against Australia, Canada, recently against Taiwan, they have all backfired and led to more distrust of China and more rallying around the flag and anti-China sentiment. So I think that maybe that's a good way of thinking about it, and it by no means solves this definitional problem, but it's particularly US sanctions that I think blur the boundary through the enormous global influence of the dollar. But it might still be helpful to kind of take the sting out of some of these discussions. And I think, we're in a general era where defensive economic statecraft is on the rise, and probably that'll be fine. And we just need to allow that states can do a lot more than they used to be able to do in the last 40 years in that internal space.
We have another great question, and I'm gonna fold it into a segue to sort of the next general topic here. So the question posed is, are we actually seeing an effect in consumers and goods and services? Is there actually an impact for individuals? I mean, another way to push that question a little more globally is, who are the winners and losers, and I guess that to return to a question I wanted to ask at the beginning, and I'll ask it now. As we think about best practices, or we think about ways to structure these relationships in a better way moving forward, what is the problem that we're trying to solve with our best practices? What are we aiming to do? So that's another really big bucket of questions, maybe loosely joined together. I'll turn first to you, Harlan.
That is a big bucket of questions, but to take the last part that you were raising first, right? I think that we do need to kind of think about, as we think about solutions, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve? And is it the same as the ones that we were trying to solve with existing institutions? And I think what we see now is the problem is less about trying to figure out when you can use these various different tools, either offensive or defensive, but rather how you use these tools and what happens once you invoke them, right? Because going back to what we were saying at the beginning, right, states do feel insecure in a different way now. They're going to use these tools. They feel like these things are necessary. Trying to kind of constrain whether or not they can use them at all is probably a fool's errand. What we really need, and this goes back to Henry's point, are ways for states to both kind of properly signal their intentions, right? So there isn't miscommunication, right? And for other states to be able to kind of know what is actually being sort of what the actual intentions of other states are, so they know whether or not they should be complaining, whether or not they should be engaging in diplomacy, whether or not they should be responding with their own countermeasures, right? So we need kind of ways, we need rules that will allow states to better communicate what they're actually trying to do to avoid miscommunication and accidental escalation. And we need rules beyond that, not for really when to use these, but what happens once they're in place, right? So rules for things like proportionality, rules for things like harm minimization, rules for things like process and information sharing, rules perhaps for compensation and duration. So the question then becomes, how do you create those kinds of rules? It might be that the WTO remains the best place to do that. It seems unlikely right now that that's going to really happen in a robust way there. So then the question becomes, can we start having those conversations somewhere else? It is happening in these smaller groupings of like-minded states, right? So you are seeing conversations like this at the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, or in conversations among the Quad, but eventually we're going to have to multilateralize these kinds of norms if we want to avoid exactly the kinds of miscommunications that Henry was mentioning. And I'll just come back to kind of something that Nick was raising before, that I worry, at least, right, that this distinction between defensive and offensive economic statecraft is a very hard one to maintain in our current competitive world, because the rhetoric has now just become so deeply about security. So it's very hard for states, when they see something like industrial policy in the United States, when they see the IRA or the CHIPS Act, to see it as merely defensive. And I think we're going to need to find ways for states to better be able to communicate both their concerns and their actual intentions.
And Harlan, when you talk about escalation, you mean basically a trade escalation that continues to undermine sort of the premise of free trade as a whole? So the thing that we're trying to preserve here is some, and I'm not disagreeing. So the thing we're trying to preserve here is some kind of unencumbered global trading system, and we're making a lot of inroads in that. And we'd like to maintain some of the basic parameters of that. And these are kind of mechanisms that would help us do that.
Yeah, I think that maintaining some kind of global trading system that actually works for the benefit of people is a generally good thing, but that's actually not my primary concern. My primary concern is that trade here is really a proxy for cooperation generally, right? We need to cooperate over a lot of different things, right? If you think about something like climate change, this is not something you can do unilaterally. And what you worry about is that escalation takes the form of just every state in it for itself unwilling to actually cooperate because it doesn't trust the intentions of the other parties to these various different negotiations.
Nick, since defensive and offensive were raised in Harlan's points, I don't know if you want to respond to that or just more generally.
Yeah, sure. Very quickly. I agree. It is a very hard distinction to maintain, right? It's in the eye of the beholder. But to me, the big problem that we need to solve is this tendency towards the securitization of all trade and exchange, because there's no logical endpoint, right? That everything can be labeled a dual use item ultimately, or everything can be seen as a retaliation to something that someone else did, or. But one thing that is useful to think about perhaps is, can you think about multilateral treaties that don't impose limits on what states are doing right now, but that at least ring fence a particular category of, say, traded goods or flows or forms of exchange that at all costs cannot be targeted by these measures. So not things that states are doing right now, like chips and energy and finance, but essential things like food, medicine, critical civilian technologies. And my thinking here is that this would actually help preserve some core of sanctions as a legitimate tool for the enforcement of international law in the cases of the most egregious violations, right? There's been a huge problem in getting global South countries on board in the sanctions against Russia. And part of that is due to fears about energy prices and food particularly. But Russia has so much food, and China also has so much food stockpiled, that if the West, for example, were to come forward and say, we will create a multilateral treaty where we put food and medicine beyond the pale of sanctions, no real leverage would be given up in that sense, because that was never going to be something that would be used effectively against Russia and China, but it would hugely benefit the legitimacy of multilateral sanctions in the eyes of the vast middle of the international community that is neither G7 nor Russia and China. And in that sense, I think we can think about that. Another area would be critical civilian technologies, aviation, for example, civilian aviation. One of the key things that you saw, right, is that the sanctions on Russian aviation sector by Boeing and Airbus, for example, have not resulted in what people expected, which is just a huge shutdown of air traffic. And the reason for that is that we may have, as Western countries, blocked Russian flights from our airspace, but there are still more than 100 Russian flights a day going to all sorts of Asian countries. So those countries don't just have a financial, but also a prudential incentive to supply Russia with components and servicing, because there might be Russian planes that fall out of the sky or cause collisions in their airspace, right? So this is a global public commons, a public good sort of issue. And I think there, we can think about multilateral agreements. Yeah.
That's terrific. That's really helpful. So Sarah, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, that's I really appreciate Nick's point around ring fencing certain types of goods, particularly food and medicine. I think that is a super valuable perspective. Although I also think that that it's hard to get governments on board with agreeing that they will never use tools around these particular issues, which is why I think that one of the things that's really important here is to, alongside work to think about ways to update more more formal rules around trade is also to continue less formal group-based discussions, particularly around setting principles of restraint of use. So this kind of goes along with what Harlan was talking about with respect to the TTC and the Quad. The G7 over the summer released a communique on economic statecraft and concerns over economic coercion, which is particularly interesting given that there is a very specific example of Japan using economic coercion against South Korea, and yet Japan was leading on that particular document that said that economic coercion was unacceptable from a G7 perspective, although the question then becomes, how do you define economic coercion? And as Harlan mentioned, I think, again, it is important for allies to be talking with one another and finding ways to coordinate and to develop kind of more informal institutions around these practices, but it is also incredibly important for countries that are not allies to be talking as well, to avoid unnecessary escalation. And I think that just having those, so I guess my point is that in this particular issue space, where because so much gets placed in the bucket of security, and therefore countries are very reluctant to agree to binding constraints on their actions, that means necessarily that we must create space for dialogue, even in informal settings, because those are the places where we are most likely to see restraint become more prevalent. I have more to say on this, but it might turn into a little bit of a there's issues around like defensive, the kind of thinking about the defensive issues that the US with. We're at anyway, so I'll stop there, although I'll stop.
No, I'm sorry. These are very we tend to end these right on the hour, and I'll let us go 2 or 3 minutes late because I certainly want to turn it back to you, Henry. Almost everything that's been said in the last 10 minutes has to do with the points that you've made. So I want to kick the entire conversation back to you to address whatever issues you'd like to in the remaining minutes we have.
Thank you, Ingrid. I agree with everything that has been said. I would only caution that we should watch out against the risk of a race to the bottom, when he who fights too long against the dragons become a dragon himself. We see that the big problem is that China's path of development is very different from the previous waves of industrialization in East and Southeast Asia. When you see that with better economic development come with rising wages and also more social welfare and more democracy eventually. But China's economic model actually reduced the overall welfare because the wages are artificially depressed and you do not have increase or sometimes even reduction in terms of the welfare. And also there's a backtracking in democratization. When you think that in the 80s and 90s, actually the Chinese government was thinking of free elections, but that has been dropped from the agenda a long time ago. So I think the problem now is how the US and other Western countries, when they are dealing with China, to try to avoid falling into the trap of try to out-China China by becoming more like China, basically. So you see that in China, you have a kind of a dual system where most of the fruits of economic growth were handed out as subsidies to SOEs. And we see a dangerous, trend in the US and EU, for example, with all these new legislation, for example, the CHIPS Act, and so on, which would give out subsidies, to firms which are handpicked by the government. Whether that will lead to foreign capitalism, whether the US, following China's examples of a censorship, for example, of TikTok and WeChat, whether that would hurt the very foundations of the US democracy, that is the free speech. That is something that we really need to keep in mind, that to think hard before we decide to take anything, that would, make us more like China in a way.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm going to give each speaker maybe 30 seconds. I hate to leave it without giving everybody just a last second to draw listeners' attention to something that we've missed. So I'll start with you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. So my I think I want to just end on the note of actually thinking a bit more about multipolarity, or particularly the multiplicity of states compared to the period in which sanctions were designed. That they were designed when there were about 50 or 60 sovereign states in the world. We're now approaching 200, and that one of the lessons of the last few years is that sovereignty and sovereign decision-making by states really matters, but there are really many states that are excluded from the table when it comes to designing these principles. And part of that is just inevitable, but I think we have kind of given up on the ambition at all to come up with universalizable rules. And I think that you can come up with some. They will be more minimal, probably, than what we have now, but it would seem good to me to start thinking about that and come up with some actual rules that other countries outside of the G7, Russia, China, sort of global north, could subscribe to as well. That's just the thought I want to leave everyone with.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Sarah?
Yeah, real quickly, I'll just say, again, in the beginning, I spoke about how we have these complex economic networks. And so even when we cut ties dyadically, that doesn't necessarily lead to kind of the insulation that we're seeking. And so I think that it's really important in this space to pay attention to that complexity and to the fact that kind of adjustment and adaptation to tools of economic statecraft oftentimes create even more complex structures that are harder to see. And that because of that, I think that really emphasizing informal pathways to build trust and expectations among allies, and also with adversaries around principles of restraint are incredibly important as a path forward.
Terrific. Thank you. Harlan?
Thanks. So I think this picks up on what other people have said. So, international law plays a lot of different roles, and in international economic law, for at least a while now, we've thought of it as something that's going to resolve discrete disputes. I think we need to be thinking about the ways in which international law also structures discourse, that it provides means for bringing people together. It provides expectations about justification, right? And I think that we should really be thinking about ways to emphasize the way that international law can play those roles in a time where the situation looks much more uncertain. And people have talked a lot about de-risking with regard to supply chains. I think we need to be thinking about international law de-risking our rhetoric.
De-risking our rhetoric. That's really helpful. All right, last word to you, Henry.
Thanks. I would say that China might be the biggest problem facing international law today, but I hope that in dealing with the China challenge, we as international lawyers would also come up with new ways to rethink how to design innovative, more resilient rules of international law, so that we can continue this world that is governed by international law rather than law of the jungle. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you, as usual, for all of the help from Cambridge University Press. This concludes the webinar.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We'll be sharing the recording of this webinar within the next week. So you can find it on AJIL's homepage within a few days. AJIL's collection of archival research on this topic is available at the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/AJIL. And many thanks again to the panelists for their insights and to all of you for your time today. Have a great weekend.